Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our event, Building Back Better Through Electrification. I'm Heather Bakken, President of the Canadian Club of Ottawa. I would say the virtual president right now. While we're meeting on a virtual platform, I would like to acknowledge the rights of the Indigenous peoples to the land each one of us is on before we start our discussion today. For members of the Canadian Club of Ottawa, it is unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin. Anishinaabe are the original inhabitants of the territory where the Parliament buildings overlook the Ottawa River, which is just downstream to one of the most sacred sites for Indigenous peoples. The Algonquin have a holistic relationship with the land and waterways that sustain our ecosystem. We are grateful for that. Thank you for hosting us on your ancestral territory. On behalf of today's participants, we reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their culture. Respectfully, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people from coast to coast to coast. Miigwech. We are thrilled to have you here today as we launch our 2021 season for the Canadian Club of Ottawa. This season, our club will focus on offering timely policy discussions that inform, engage, and inspire community strength in a pandemic and post-pandemic world. Our theme is nation building in the time of COVID-19, supporting Canadian business and innovation for a sustainable economic recovery. We're excited to have the leaders of Canada's electricity sector with us here today to do just that, totally on point, discuss post-COVID-19 recovery efforts through electrification. Your moderator for the next hour is Frances Bradley, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Electricity Association. CEA is a national voice of electricity and serves its electricity industry members through the work of expert professionals led by Bradley and directed by a board of directors comprised of member CEOs. Mr. Bradley is a co-chair of the National Cross-Sector Forum, overseeing Canada's action plan for critical infrastructure. He also sits on the steering committee for the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council and sits on the board for the Energy Council of Canada. At the North American Electric Reliability Corporation's Member Representatives Committee and Board of Trustees meetings, he represents CEA and advocates strongly for its members and their activities related to the Electric Reliability Organization enterprise and its role in ensuring the reliability and security of the North American bulk power system. He was recently named to the Positive Energy Advisory Council, and under the auspices of the University of Ottawa, the council undertakes research to determine how various energy interests can seek and obtain broad social support on energy policies, regulation, and individual energy projects and technologies. And Mr. Bradley, clearly you have a lot of energy yourself, because that is a massive undertaking. And what better time to discuss about the infrastructure than right now, as all eyes are turned on it. We also have 5 panelists who are going to hopefully enlighten you and inform you, and also, most importantly, engage you in today's discussion. First, Patrick D Bateman. He's the interim president of Water Power Canada. Mr. Bateman is a clean and renewable energy professional who has spent the last decade working in policy and market development leadership roles in the electric industry in Canada. As the interim president with Water Power Canada, he serves as a Canadian hydropower industry's spokesperson. He leads and shapes the association's involvement in federal initiatives, including climate change policy and environmental assessment. Michelle Branigan is the Chief Executive Officer of Electricity Human Resources Canada. Ms. Branigan is a recognized leader in the electricity industry who works closely with industry stakeholders to address labor market and human resource challenges. As a champion of diversity and inclusion, she is passionate about real change for the advancement of women and underrepresented groups, having spearheaded many instrumental programs for stakeholders in Canada's electricity sector. John Gorman is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Nuclear Association. Mr. Gorman is past President and CEO of Canadian Solar Industries Association, a director on the board of the Energy Council of Canada, and held the position of Canada's designate to the International Energy Agency Executive Committee. He's using this experience to secure a leading role for nuclear energy at the heart of Canada's energy transition. Robert Horning is the president and CEO of Canadian Renewable Energy Association. Mr. Horning joins the organization after serving as a president of the Canadian Wind Energy Association since 2003. During his time as president, he represented the interests of CAMWEA's members, wind farm owners, operators, project developers, consultants, manufacturers, and service providers. Today, with members and stakeholders, he helped facilitate wind energy growth in Canada from under 300 megawatts to over 13,000 megawatts of installed capacity through advocacy and engagement efforts. And finally, we have Elisa Oberman, who is the Executive Director of Marine Renewables Canada. Ms. Oberman works to facilitate technology innovation in the sector by advocating for supportive policies, identifying international business development opportunities, and enhancing the capacity of the local supply chain. She has also designed and led numerous engagement and outreach activities to grow knowledge and support for marine renewable energy development. She is a founding member of the Canadian Council on Renewable Energy, also known as CANCOR, an advisory board member of the National Research Council's Ocean, Coastal, and River Engineering Research Center, and a director on the Offshore Energy Research Association's board. This is a mighty panel, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot about the opportunities presented to us in Canada during this time. There will be a silver lining. A few housekeeping notes before the panel kicks into high gear. If your internet quality as a viewer is poor, or you're feeling that there's a bit of lag in the stream, there is a little notification you'll see on your screen that says click here to switch stream, and that allows you to view at a lower bandwidth. The video quality will decrease slightly, but the audio should remain the same. And the key is you want to hear what everybody here has to say, because they have a tremendous amount of expertise we can all learn from. If you're having a technical issue beyond that, please click on the request help. That's also a bubble at the bottom right corner of the webcast page. Your help request will be emailed back to the address that you provided when you registered for today's event. Zishan will get on that right away for you. To ask a question, very important for the engagement part of this discussion, simply click on the questions tab if you want to cast your eyes now and see where that is. Type in your question and click submit. The moderator will receive the questions, and you may ask the question at any time during the webcast. So strike while the iron's hot. If someone says something you want to comment on, that's the time to submit your question, and hopefully we'll be able to get up to all of them. And that's about it for today's presentation. We hope you enjoy the discussion. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Francis Bradley to take it away from here.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, Heather, for that introduction. I join with you. I'm looking forward to the discussion today, and it is incredibly timely. You know, we are here in Canada at a significant point in this transformation, and you know, at this point in time, it isn't just about the pandemic. You know, while the pandemic seems to be all-consuming right now, the direction that we're heading in towards greater use of electricity was accelerating before the pandemic hit. We're on a glide path to a decarbonized future. We have a high degree of social consensus to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we've got a government that's committed to net zero emissions by 2050. So, in that context, Canada can't decarbonize without substantially more electricity. Low carbon and non-emitting electricity will be core to reducing our GHGs as we go forward, and all sources and all new technologies will be needed. New technologies will allow us to produce power in more distributed locations. It will eliminate waste in the system, store energy for when it's needed, and enhance the grid to better serve the needs of digitally sophisticated business and residential customers. So how do we decarbonize through electrification? We'll talk about that today, but you know, to begin with, already more than 80% of Canada's electricity is non-emitting. But electricity is only about 20% of Canada's overall energy use. So electricity will allow us to decarbonize other sectors and increase that ratio. This is an achievable goal, but you know, we've got to get at it. As we think about post-COVID economic recovery, it makes sense to see how we can advance this goal. There's a lot of people on this virtual stage today, but there is one electricity sector. We might all specialize in different components and different sections of that electricity sector, but we are all moving forward as one, as colleagues, not as competitors, because the challenge of the future is going to demand a collaborative approach. So we want to discuss today how we can meet this challenge, what it might look like, and what it might look like where, because it may look differently depending upon where you are in the country. So with that as an introduction, let me get into the dialogue with our panel. And let's start off with just very simply, as we need more electricity, how can your part of the electricity sector and the segment that you represent, how can it play a role, and what will that role look like? And maybe let's begin with Patrick, seeing as how right now water power is the largest contributor to Canada's electricity system. What is the future going to look like, Patrick?
Well, thank you, Francis, and thank you to everybody attending today and to the Canadian Club. So the role of hydropower today is 61% of Canada's total electricity. Hydropower in our reservoirs is also our largest source of energy storage, and the fleet is also very flexible and dependable and affordable. So today, hydropower plays an enormous role. Looking forward, we could almost double our production in the years and decades ahead. And I'll maybe just start by mentioning kind of three quick areas where those increases could be achieved. Number one, refurbishment and redevelopment of our existing units and sites. It's possible to increase capacity, improve efficiency. Number two, new transmission lines to bring that clean energy that's available to areas where there is demand for it, be that within a province or between provinces. And then number three, there's also other interesting and innovative projects that can increase the role that hydropower plays, increasing flexibility, increasing energy storage. And I hope I'll have the chance to talk a bit more about those later in the session.
Okay, great. Thank you, Patrick. Elisa, why don't we go out to the East Coast, where you are, and what role will marine renewables potentially play in Canada's electricity future?
Yeah, so as most people know, marine renewable energy is in very early stages. And we talk about marine renewable energy, we're talking about tides, waves, rivers, and also offshore wind. But these are untapped resources that we have across the country. So even if you're in a different province where it's landlocked, there's a river current resource there. So the first thing I would say is, these resources, although they are not really contributing to the grid at this point, as the demand for more clean energy because of increased electrification occurs, there's definitely a role there for these resources because they are massive and in every province. And then the other thing I would just mention too is just as all of us are collaborating here today, within the sector, all of our respective resources that we're focused on also have a role to work together and integrate together. So when it comes to marine renewable energy, for example, one thing that we focus on and are trying to understand better is how do we help support and complement resources like solar and wind that are low cost now, and how do we get to that point where we can be more affordable, but also providing an asset in terms of predictability, reliability that, for example, tidal has, because we know the cycles of the tides, we can predict them, and that offers other benefits to the electricity system as well. So I think for us, we're just looking for, how do we get this resource to a point and the technology to a point where it can really help to support some of those needs in the future.
Right. Hey, John, from the nuclear perspective, what does the future look like, and what part is nuclear going to play in our electricity future, kind of now out to 2050?
I was on mute there, wasn't I? Listen, firstly, thanks for that. And if I could just give a shout out to Heather and the Canadian Club for hosting this important discussion. I'm really delighted to be here with my colleagues and really proud to be part of a sector that is collaborating at such an unprecedented level in light of the challenges we face. Francis, I just wanted to add a word to your opening context and reference the IEA report, which has just come out on energy technology perspectives that says, you know, spreading the use of electricity into more parts of the economy is the single largest contributor to reaching net zero emissions, okay, across the board. And to Patrick's point, we need to double the current generation just to decarbonize things through electricity, let alone talking about other things like creating hydrogen, et cetera. So, and as you mentioned, you know, we've got one of the cleanest electricity grids in the world, in the developed world. And it's our greatest asset in terms of working towards net zero. And the folks on this panel, you know, they're the ones who are, their sectors are producing that clean energy. So we're really in a leadership position here. When it comes to nuclear, our sector already is playing a role, right? We're 15% of Canada's clean electricity. There's 2/3 of it in Ontario, 1/3 of it in New Brunswick. Has been for more than 60 years. Nuclear enabled the lion's share of the coal phase out that we had here in Ontario, 89% of coal replaced by enhanced nuclear. You know, largest carbon reduction initiative in North America. We've got constant innovation going on that is increasing our production. We've got a refurb, the largest infrastructure project in Canada right now that is fueling an incredibly healthy nuclear ecosystem, right? So we're there front and center, and we're shaping up to be a world leader in terms of bringing the next generation of nuclear, referred to it as small modular reactors, to the electricity grid starting in 2027, with the very small ones in 2029 for some of the bigger small modular reactors. So nuclear is bringing a lot to the table, and really proud to have been you know, part of this clean electricity mix that we have discussing our energy challenges today.
Thanks, John. Thank you. How about you, Robert? Your space is now, you're the longest serving association CEO on the panel, but your current association is the newest one. But you're now in the wind, solar, and energy storage space. So what's the future look like in terms of the role that those segments of the electricity sector are going to play in the future?
Yeah, thank you very much, Francis. And I also really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank everyone for participating. I think these technologies are a really good example of how rapidly things are transforming within the electricity sector. Over the last decade, there's been more new generating capacity installed in wind and solar than in any other electricity generating source in the country. And we've moved from essentially being an insignificant part of total electricity generation to 7% of Canada's generation in a decade. So there's been tremendous change going forward. And when we look forward, I think we're very positive. Everybody's talked about the fact that we're going to need to meet net zero to double our electricity system. And we think our technologies will play an important role in contributing to that with everyone else here on the panel, because they're abundant and untapped. We have tremendous wind and solar resources in every part of the country. They can play a very key role in ensuring that this transformation is affordable. We've seen dramatic declines in the cost. Wind energy costs have declined 70% in 10 years. Solar costs have declined almost 90% in 10 years. And in that time period, we're now in a situation where wind energy is actually the lowest cost source of new electricity generation in the country. And the International Energy Agency last week actually stated that solar energy now offers some of the lowest cost electricity ever seen globally. So we will have an important role in terms of maintaining an affordable electricity system going forward. And the other element I'd ask is that mention is that these technologies are distributed and they're scalable. We can build large wind and solar energy farms. We can put solar PV on a residential rooftop. And that's going to introduce a significant amount of flexibility into the system, which will allow us to seek out efficiencies and reduce costs. And it will also allow customers and consumers who are increasingly interested in knowing where their energy is coming from and having some say in that, to actually pursue energy choices and also to, in essence, take steps to produce energy themselves. So I think we'll see a pretty significant change going forward with all of these technologies involved.
Michelle, let's turn to you for a moment. We've up until now talked a lot about technology. What about people? And how does that fit into the future of the electricity sector here in Canada?
Thanks, Francis. And as you've heard, we're all, everyone's talking about change. Today's electricity industry looks very different than it did even 10 or 15 years ago. Energy policy is going green, new technologies, as you heard, changing the grid, and the workforce isn't getting any younger either. And in the same way that our generation mix has evolved to include solar and wind, our workforce now includes solar PV installers and wind technicians, for example. So those changes in technology, be it AI, smart grids, electrification, that's going to bring tremendous opportunities as well as challenges around upskilling and developing a workforce that can continuously adapt. If we just look even at one example of electrification in the transportation area, rapid growth in electrical vehicles, of course, is going to really increase demand overall for electricity. That's going to require modifications, upgrades to the existing grid infrastructure to handle that load increase. And then if we even look to move to buildings, whether that's energy efficiency refits or new build, there's going to be new jobs created all along the manufacturing supply chain. And we always have to remember that electricity in Canada depends on its workforce to be there 24/7. We're not a just-in-time industry. We need to be able to plan well in advance for labor market needs. That's going to take coordination from employers, from policymakers, for educators, to make sure that the electricity system can support new demands and loads driven by building electrification. And I just say we also need to be very proactive in our approach to workforce management. If we're not, we're going to face a couple of risks. One, potential employees go elsewhere, or we have skills gaps. We can't find people with the right skills to fill the job, and that will be very detrimental for productivity, safety, and reputation.
How far away is that, Michelle? Are we coming close to hitting some of those challenges with the gaps today, or is it?
Absolutely. Most of the turnover in the industry is still driven right now by retirements. 86% is driven by retirements, and we have to compete with other industries who are always also looking for talent, and a lot of the jobs in our industry are portable in and out of the sector. So we have to be very cognizant of that. That war for talent is underway right now. It's not something that we can plan our way out of, and anticipate that we'll get the people when we need them when we get to it. We need to be looking at that now. That succession planning, that knowledge transfer, and how do we attract that next generation to the sector? Okay,
so a couple of people had already mentioned that to be able to meet the decarbonization challenge, we're likely going to see something on the order of a doubling of requirement for electricity, out to 2050. Maybe start with you, Robert, and we can go around. What is that going to look like in terms of, we've got an interconnected grid, and there's also the evolution of distributed energy resources. What's that mix going to look like? I mean, clearly it isn't going to be all one or the other. If we're talking about doubling, it's going to have to be all of the above. How do we make sure that it all comes together and the grid continues to be stable?
Well, I think it's that the term of interconnection is key. The future grid is going to be much more diverse. It's going to be much more distributed, but it also will need to be much more interconnected in order to function efficiently and to generate the most efficient cost savings. And we tend to think of interconnection as building big transmission lines, from one place to another to connect the grid. That's part of it, and it's going to play an important role. But there's other forms of interconnection that are occurring. We have a transmission system and a distribution system, and the lines between them are blurring. And we're starting to see more interconnection between those two going forward. We're starting to see new technologies in terms of smart grid technologies that are allowing us to interconnect electricity supply with demand, with electric vehicles, with other things, another form of interconnection that's going on. And so all of these things have the opportunity to provide us with more options, increased flexibility, which I think is going to push us towards increased efficiency and reduced costs. So I think it's a very good news story overall.
And then, Patrick, hydro has traditionally been the backbone of that interconnected grid. are we ready for a future that's going to be more connected? And it sounds like it's going to be more digital and smarter. It's going to have to be able to manage those flows. Are we ready for that?
Well, I think often when we think about a long-term goal that represents a doubling or a tripling of where we are today, that can seem like a scary undertaking. But the reality is we just need to take steps toward that. The further we get out in time, the more complex the challenge is. And we understand that, and we need to start planning for that now. But really, when we think of our 2030 Paris Agreement targets, all of the folks on the call here today understand what our sectors can offer. There's an enormous amount of innovation taking place in every sector, whether it's at the distribution, the transmission, the generation, each of the sub-generation types. That innovation creates enormous job creation potential, investment potential. And I think this is really the key part of the story. It's a big challenge, but we need to start now, and there's a lot of opportunity to be created along the way.
You mentioned new technologies being coming forward. I've got to ask, Elisa, your association is all about new technologies. Everything that's taking place in this space is new. How far are we from seeing some of those technologies feeding in a significant way into the integrated grid?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, we've had some projects that have moved forward and have been grid connected. I would say we're very much still in the demonstration phase. But even recently, there's been more funding and investment going into the sector. So I would say even into early next year, we will start to see more deployments of the technologies. And what we really need are those deployments and demonstrations, because until we get to a point where there's more volume and scale of technology being tested, we really won't get to a point where we see cost reductions. So I'd say the next 2 years for the marine renewable sector is pretty critical to see, how it can play this role in the future.
And then, John, some of your members are speaking of new technologies. A couple of minutes ago, you mentioned small modular reactors. That's kind of leading edge right now, if not bleeding edge. How far are we from that world?
I'm definitely going to go with the leading edge terminology right now. Francis, Canada is a first mover and a world leader in the free world anyway, in terms of rolling out these small modular reactors. Of course, they've been around for a long time, right? For many decades now, powering icebreakers and other types of vessels. But this next generation of technology has been under development for a couple of decades, and because of recent advancements in technology, and of course this increased anxiety we have around climate change, combined with the growing recognition that we really aren't making progress quickly enough, the development has really accelerated, right? And so you likely saw, and many people listening today saw in the news in the last couple of weeks, that both the United States and Canada have been rolling out funding for this next generation of small modular reactors. We've seen the beginning of the licensing and the beginning of construction in Idaho for a number of units of the NuScale technology, and there are a number of other technologies that are right on the heels there. Here in Canada, we've got 12 technologies that are going through the review and licensing process now, and some of those in late stages. These small modular reactors, I should say, for folks who aren't familiar with them, you can kind of think of them like a personal computer compared to a conventional mainframe or something like that. They're very distributable. They're also very scalable. So they can be as small as 2 megawatts, let's say, providing clean heat and clean electricity to a First Nations community, right up to 300 megawatts and being connected to an electricity grid. And indeed, we have technologies and projects that are in the works right now that fit all sorts of projects in between there. The very small ones we're going to see by 2026 or 2027 actually deployed in some Canadian markets. The larger ones, which are now slated for one in the Darlington site, and also Saskatchewan has announced plans for the larger small modular reactors. The one in Ontario, we're pretty confident we're going to see that before 2029. So these things are imminent, right? Less than a decade is an instant in the electricity planning world. So the small modular reactors, as I said, the next generation of technology, inherent safety features, but really what makes them so unique in my mind, and maybe a missing piece of the puzzle here in the Canadian energy transition, is the fact that they produce 24/7 heat as well as clean electricity, right? So we're talking about scalable things that can load follow and support wind and solar. At the same time, we could use the heat, very high temperature heat, to create high temperature steam with our extraction industries like oil and gas. Use the heat or the electricity to create hydrogen, put them in mining operations for heat and electricity. A lot of advanced discussions going on there right now. And of course, a big element in helping to decarbonize some of those hard to reach places, the industrial processes like cement and steel. So yeah, the small modular reactors are here. Canada's a leader, and I would say at the heart of the energy transition.
So you mentioned Indigenous communities and remote communities. I mean, that's been a priority for this government. It's been a priority for other governments previously as well. What is the future look like? Because often when we talk about the future of the electricity sector, we're talking about, writ large and for the majority of Canadians. What about for the minority of Canadians that are in remote communities? You mentioned small modular reactors. Robert, what about some of the technologies that we're seeing in your space? What role are they likely to play in the future for remote communities and potentially remote and Indigenous communities?
Yeah, and it's you've identified that it clearly is an increasing priority for governments, for example, to be looking at opportunities there. But more importantly, it's the communities themselves that are looking for opportunities to get off very expensive and polluting diesel fuel, whether it's for the community itself or an industrial operation up there. And there are a range of technologies that can potentially play a role. Solar can, wind can, hydro can, a number of different technologies John was mentioning as well. And so right now we're at a stage where we've got a number of communities that are actively exploring different options and determining which ones work best for them based on their resource base, based on their capacity in order to maintain and work with that technology going forward. But it's growing, and I think one of the stories of the electricity sector going forward, regardless of technology, is going to be the increased and active participation of First Nations communities and Indigenous peoples in these projects. We see a very strong desire to be part of these projects or to build these projects on their own, on large scale, small scale. And for the last 3 years, I'll just use one example in the wind and solar space, at least 30 to 40% of projects have Indigenous community ownership, for example, in those projects. And that trend is only going to continue to grow going forward.
So the expansion, what we're talking about is an expansion of what constitutes the electricity sector. I mean, it used to be a large central plant, transmission, distribution to the customer. And now we're seeing a multiplicity of different approaches, and some of them are moving out to remote communities. Michelle, that's got to be a pretty significant challenge in terms of changing what the even the basic human resource requirements are going to be for the sector, and the skill sets have to be changing very rapidly.
Absolutely, and at the same time, you're trying to manage the legacy systems as well, too, right? So we've got these two competing things happening at the same time, and all the changes, and still keeping the lights on in the way that we're accustomed to from a generation, distribution, and transmission perspective. And I would say that in relation to that, any transition to cleaner energy in Canada has to be built upon inclusive policies. That's extremely important. And we know that we need to build our bench strength right now. So we need to be looking at all of those underrepresented groups when we look from a skills lens. We know that we don't have enough women working in the industry. We know that we don't have enough Indigenous people working in the industry. So we need to do more than, and know that we need to actively move forward and work with those communities to try and provide them with pathways in the sector. There's a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah. So I do want to get to back to the title of the panel and to talk about building back better, but I do want to touch on 2050, because 2050 is one of those lines in the sand that's been drawn, and get a sense from each of you, what does 2050 look like? Sort of cast your mind forward into 2050, and maybe Elisa, let's start with you. In an ideal world, what what does 2050 look like from a marine renewable standpoint, and what is that going to mean for the customer ultimately?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think it's a big question because things change so rapidly with technology. But when I think of the progress that has been made, just even in the past couple of years in the marine renewable sector globally, and I'll cast it as that, not just in Canada, we are seeing innovation in that technology and costs coming down and more deployments. And also, since we've been talking about Indigenous and remote communities, we're seeing some of those projects globally as well, where marine renewables can contribute to those. So I would say when I think of, the sector that I'm focused on, we would see it technology that is, the costs have been reduced. It's much more similar to wind and solar. And perhaps it's not just at a utility scale, but we're looking at a technology that's helping coastal and island communities all around the world. So I think there's that kind of export potential, and that's something that Canada has been very focused on. So I would also highlight that we have this role to play in global leadership and international trade as well with the sector.
Okay. Robert, I'll just jump over to you just as the same question. I kind of see a link from some of the conversations you and I have had in the past about the coastal communities, and I know that that's certainly part of the conversation. But what does 2050 look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I want to answer that from a specific technology perspective. I think more broadly for all of us on the panel, I expect we would imagine that in 2050, clean electricity would be the largest source of energy being utilized in Canada. You mentioned earlier it's 20% of total energy today. I think if we're going to meet our climate goals, it's got to be the largest single source. And I think we will use energy more efficiently. I think we will absolutely have to, and energy efficiency will be a key priority for us going forward. But I think in terms of the services that Canadians receive from energy, I would expect that they don't see much of a difference at all. I think they should be still able to do all of the things that they do today, perhaps more efficiently, hopefully less costly going forward. And I expect we will see increasing opportunities for individual and corporate or institutional participation in the system, whether that is self-supply or just taking more control of your role in the system and how you use and produce energy going forward.
Great. Patrick, with water power being currently like the foundation to our system, and you mentioned that there is a potential to double that in the future. How far along to that doubling will we get to by 2050, do you think? Because there's some barriers, right? And we could talk about barriers as well, but what does 2050 look like, and what do we need to do to get there?
Well, I wouldn't want to put a number on it, but I could say that I would expect that 2050 looks like one that leverages the competitive advantages that we have today, which would include our existing hydropower base. And then on top of that, our enormous amount of untapped energy resources, including those represented by us all here today. So competitive advantages, I think, building there and focusing on our synergies. So if we consider Atlantic Canada and New England, we'll likely have a very large energy peak in winter. And in Quebec and Labrador, we've got enormous amount of energy just sitting in our reservoirs ready to go. In Ontario, we've got a summer peak, so that excess energy can be redirected over there. There's natural variations in our wind energy profile, in our solar energy profile. So I think it's focusing on making sure that all of those competitive advantages work together is what the lens that I would view 2050 through.
Okay, and then how about you, John? Also, much like Patrick, you're in an association with technology and players that are playing the long game. What does the 2050 long game look like for nuclear?
Oh, well, like Robert and I guess Patrick, I'd prefer to not take a sort of technology view on this, Francis. I hope that 2050 for Canadians is a point of reflection and pride, where we We just look back on 30 years of effort based on a recovery plan and an energy transition that we adopted in 2020, you know, on the heels of a global pandemic. That's our opportunity right now. And, you know, that plan has got to be focused on conservation and efficiency, as Robert said. It's got to be a plan that leverages our existing clean electricity resources to the maximum, as Patrick pointed out. And, you know, invests in these areas of Canadian expertise that are developing, like hydrogen and like nuclear and small modular reactors. I mean, we've got existing know-how and resources which are giving us an edge in terms of a clean electricity grid. We've got to continue to invest in those, in all of those. And at the same time, we have to look at these technologies that are really up and coming, whether it's marine renewables and this incredible, you know, tidal resources that we have around the country, or hydrogen, what have you. So, and in the Canadian context, you know, this has got to reflect our regional differences, right? And we have to ensure that each region has access to the technologies and to the mix of things that make sense for them to create a carbon-free, competitive products and services. So, you know, and as an aside there, Francis, I'll just sort of point out, it's on my mind lately because of the development of the small modular reactors. But we have 4 provinces now. Their premiers have signed a memorandum of understanding to develop and deploy small modular reactors in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, New Brunswick. And, you know, each of these provinces has its own economic base, its own requirements and needs around phasing out coal or whatever it is they're trying to do. New Brunswick is trying to become a center of excellence in next generation technologies. Ontario is trying to build on this incredible base that it's got going. Alberta and Saskatchewan have these hard to decarbonize sectors and things like that. So these 4 conservative provinces working with the federal government to look at tools like this, that flexibility is important. And I guess lastly, what I'd say is that we have to have a plan here that enables Canada not only to reach its own targets, but as Lisa said, you know, we have an opportunity here to help other natural resource intensive economies around the world. So I hope we do that. And by 2050, we're feeling pretty good about ourselves.
So that gives us the segue. Thank you, John. That brings us really down to the question of building back better. What does that actually look like as we exit COVID-19? And what do we think the government should be focusing on? So maybe, John, we heard from you. Let's go to Patrick. Patrick, what do you think the priority for the government should be as we exit COVID-19? Hopefully sometime soon, and then start getting into the building back better. What does building back better mean?
Well, it's a great question, Francis. And I think first and foremost, before we think too far beyond first principles, we got to make sure that the focus remains public health. We got to make sure that our economic sectors recover quickly and recover robustly. And it's that first step which makes sure that there is demand for the energy that we all supply. So that's step number 1. Step number 2, I think our economic situation is not optimal right now. Public funds are tight. So I think any efforts that can be made to streamline regulatory processes, remove undue regulatory burden, again, can yield a large amount of bang for the buck. And then thirdly, I would say, as we're building back better, we've got economic recovery, but still progress toward our greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets. I think remaining focused on some of the underpinning climate action policies is going to be of key importance to make sure that investment is directed in the right direction. So I'm thinking about things like carbon pricing, clean fuel standard. We're already seeing a lot of progress being driven even by the notion of these things. And if we continue to implement and strengthen them, I'm very confident that we'll see a lot of economic activity happen as a result.
Okay, I know we kind of touched on it as we kind of went around on the other questions. So I'm just cognizant of, I've got a number of questions that have now come in from our from our audience. So why don't I jump to these questions and we can see how many we can get through in the next 10 to 15 minutes. First off, Paul, energy policy is driven primarily at the provincial level with a national overlay, for example, climate change. and Canada is a mixture of public and private sector ownership of generation assets. How do you see these realities influencing our ability to meet our targets? So the federal provincial challenge, the public and private ownership, are they barriers or not in terms of meeting our long-term challenges? John, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks. What a great question. Thanks, Paul. So, yeah, it is. I will look at this question through the nuclear lens specifically. This federal-provincial dynamic is really a tough one for Canada in terms of the energy transition, right? Trying to agree on an energy transition and then a way forward. And I think some of the other my colleagues here have said we need each region to be able to choose what sort of technology mix is most appropriate for their particular challenges, right? And not all of us, not all provinces are as blessed as BC, Manitoba, and Quebec in terms of that incredible low-cost, reliable hydropower, right? And that's where the federal government needs to show direction, but also have flexibility in terms of what we need. And that's why I brought up these memorandum of understanding signed by the Conservative governments in these 4 different provinces to develop and deploy small modular reactors. And Francis, on the public versus private investment, what I will say is one of the very exciting things about small modular reactors is that they are produced in manufacturing facilities, right? Some of them are actually entirely produced there and shipped to site. They don't have to have the fuel changed for a decade or more. Others have substantially all of it produced at a manufacturing facility, and then they're shipped to a site and assembled there. Almost like a house that is, partially pre-assembled when you bring it down the road. And what that means is that the manufacturing is bringing down the cost of those generating units very significantly, and it means that the private sector is beginning to finance them. So in the nuclear context, it used to be a game of state financing, but with SMRs, it's a private financing game.
Right. Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in on the federal, provincial, or public-private challenges as we move forward?
I'll just say something just really briefly, Francis, just to say that clearly Canada is a complex country in that regard, and things get much more complicated. And the federal government has an important role to play, I think, not in terms of dictating, but in terms of facilitating. Facilitating conversation, facilitating collaboration. We have, in essence, 10 unique electricity grids in our provinces. We will be better served by increased collaboration, not just between the federal and provincial government, but between provincial governments as well. And I think we're starting to see some initial promising signs of that.
I've got a couple of questions that talk to jobs and skills. So maybe Michelle, you can lead off, and then if others have views, they can join in. Janice from New Brunswick is asking, how can K-12 education support this future shift? What kind of knowledge is going to be essential as we look to the forward? Which disciplines should we be looking at? How does this new knowledge fit with current focus on climate change education?
Oh my gosh, there's so much there. We could spend half a day on that. In regards to the K-12, yeah, absolutely. It's critical that our employers are engaging, and the majority of them are doing a very good job in this regard. Engaging with the educational institutions, even at the kindergarten to K-12 classes. That's really important because I find there's a lack of knowledge out there by both teachers and students as to the career opportunities that actually exist in the sector, right? So we need to be doing more to tell that story, to engage with those key influencers for that next generation. That's just a very short and easy way to do that. One of the other things that we need to do is ensure that our educators are talking closely to the employers about the skills that are going to be required and the changes in jobs and occupations. As I said earlier, we still have legacy systems. It's not like we're going to completely pull apart an engineering degree or et cetera, but jobs will evolve, jobs will sunset, and we want to make sure that we have the right labor market intelligence to feed down to young people, to feed down to teachers, so that they actually are working and educating themselves and training for jobs that actually will exist in the future. That's going to be really, really important. That whole transition piece. If you look even at the folks who used to work in coal, for example, those jobs are gone now, right? Or they're being transitioned out. So what do we do with those folks how do we upskill them or reskill them so that they still have a job in this industry? Because we know that we need people to be moving us along.
Okay, thanks. Hey, I got a really interesting question that came in from Alex. The discussion of net zero and doubling electricity supply speaks to meeting Canadian needs, but how does this panel see electrification allowing Canada and Canadians to generate wealth? That is new industries, exports, trading, and so on. Who'd like to start with that one? Yeah, Elisa, do you want to go ahead?
I'll just start. I'll just say a few things. I mean, it's particularly when, and I'm just using marine renewables as an example, but I think this speaks to the entire, energy sector. We have a lot of strengths in Canada, and there's also opportunities where we're on the leading edge, and we can, help other countries and provide services, technologies. And so I really see that trade piece as being, very important for that economic development and the benefit of the Canadians.
Yeah, John, you wanted to answer this one as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think we really need to recognize that Canada is unusual in its clean electricity system. 81% non-emitting electricity on our grids. And it's actually the inverse in most economies. The United States probably has 20% non-emitting and 80% is coal and gas, right? And as I mentioned earlier, as the IEA says, spreading the use of electricity into the economy is the single largest contributor to reaching net zero emissions. So what that says is that all of these developed nations and developing nations are going to have to do a huge job of cleaning up their generation suite and making smart grids and clean electricity generally. So we can take the expertise that we've developed here, and if we can continue that leadership the way that we've demonstrated it in the past, be able to bring that expertise to other countries and benefit economically as well.
And maybe apologized in advance to the audience. There's no way we're going to be able to get to all of the questions that have come in, but let's squeeze a couple more in if we can. Can anyone speak with any authority on the role of hydrogen? Is it a viable contributor to a cleaner economy? Who'd like to talk about hydrogen?
I can.
Yeah, Patrick, sure.
I can start. Well, we certainly would like to put the hydro in hydrogen. That's what we're thinking about at the moment. So we have an abundance of hydropower, but also other non-emitting resources, as John has just been discussing. Through electrolysis, we can produce green hydrogen. And green hydrogen can be used in a variety of different end uses, including replacing higher carbon emissions intensity hydrogen in chemical processes or in oil and gas refining. It can also be used as an energy carrier in which energy can be stored for long periods of time as well. It can be injected into pipelines and blended with natural gas, or in some instances, replace natural gas either for electricity generation or for heating. I think Canada already is a global leader in hydrogen production. We've got many of the leading companies here present today. And I expect that we'll be able to capitalize that in the years ahead. And I think hydrogen is something that we're going to be hearing a lot more about in our energy transition in the years ahead.
Hey, Robert, maybe just go over to you very quickly on that one. We've seen, I think we've seen some hybrid pilot projects of wind hydrogen in remote communities in Canada. Is it going to be a feature in the future, you figure?
I think it is going to be an increasing feature in the future, as Patrick talked about. Hydrogen's capacity as a storage mechanism is going to be something that will play a role. And clearly hydrogen has a role to play in some areas where electricity is going to have a harder challenge. For example, long distance transportation or things like this. There will be a role for hydrogen to play. I would just, I guess, emphasize that once again, Canada's clean electricity platform or foundation will serve us very well, because ultimately we're going to need to be concerned about what are the feedstocks of hydrogen, what is the carbon intensity of the hydrogen we're producing, And Canada, again, is in a position to be a global leader in the production of green hydrogen going forward.
Okay, and again, keeping my eye on the clock here. Just one final question, and we'll ask all five of you to weigh in on this. Cast your mind forward to a time, hopefully not too far into the future, when we can actually see people face to face. You are stuck in the elevator with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Natural Resources. You have 15 seconds in that elevator to pitch one thing that you believe we need to do to be able to move closer to this vision of 2050. What's the one thing that you would put in their ear? And why don't we start with Michelle?
Oh my God, I have four. I would just say diversity, absolutely essential. A continuing focus on skills development, specifically for youth. They only represent 5% of this industry. I would like to see trades held in higher esteem in this country. I think we need to do a lot of work still to push that agenda along. And I think, really moving forward to support students get their experience and work integrated learning, et cetera, to be able to move into this industry with the competencies and the skills that they need.
Robert, what's the one thing that you would pitch?
Recognize that we are a global leader in clean electricity production and leverage that to use that clean electricity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in other sectors, positioning us to sell the knowledge, the services, and the technology to do something that the whole world is ultimately going to have to do and that we can be a leader on.
All right, Patrick, your pitch.
So my pitch would be to maintain and strengthen the regulations and other policies that we have that have begun to drive investment away from high emissions intensity energy toward lower options. The options are available, and we just need those signals sent down from the highest level to make sure that that's the way that we continue to move.
Great. Elisa, what would be your pitch?
I would say make Canada ready to lead rather than follow. And so what I mean by that is when we have an opportunity in something, be ready to take that risk or take a calculated risk, because I think that's where we're going to see competitive advantages being built, and also that kind of expertise that can be distributed globally.
Okay, great. John, last word to you. You have one pitch to make.
Geez, thanks for having me come up last here too, Francis, on the best thing to do. There's been some great ideas, but look, I think the clear message coming from this discussion is that we have to start now, right? And I think, being blunt, we may be the last developed economy to introduce a recovery plan. Let's hope that maybe they're saving the best till last, and we're learning from what the other economies are bringing in that sense. But we need to deal with this Canadian energy transition. We have to have that federal leadership now. The clean electricity part of that is going to be essential. And so I would recommend to them that they focus on what has brought us to this point, and that's hydro, nuclear, water, wind, solar, and then look at the technologies that, as Lisa said, are going to make us leaders going forward. Canadian expertise in the next generation of nuclear, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and tidal power. All
right. Thank you very much. To our panelists, thanks for a terrific dialogue today. I think the bottom line here, what I'm hearing is we need a plan. We need a national plan. And we've been talking about this within the electricity sector for a while, that we need a clear national approach to electrification that recognizes regional differences, but that is a plan and gives us a sense of how we're going to get there. I host the podcast on the future of electricity. It's called The Flux Capacitor. And in previous episodes, you can hear deep dives with some of the panelists you heard today on water power, nuclear energy, wind, solar, storage. These are fascinating discussions, and they carry on well after 1 o'clock this afternoon. For concluding remarks, and with thanks of both myself and the panelists, to the Canadian Club of Ottawa and to you, Heather, thank you very much. And I hand the baton back to you.
Francis, it's been a pleasure working with you on this. I am not surprised you have your own podcast. I will tune into Flux Capacitor because you have been outstanding as a moderator today, really and truly. So I'd like to thank you specifically, your esteemed panel, the Canadian Electricity Association, and all of its members for their commitment to clean energy. If I have one takeaway today, it's feeling empowered knowing that in addition to forging an interconnected grid across the country, what you've really highlighted is that we need to be interconnected as people, our regions, our sectors, everyone. And it's the people who are going to lead us again. We have been global leaders in the world. We are innovators. We have unique capacities in Canada. So I have hope that we can build back better together. So let's stay interconnected. I would ask everyone to join us for our next Canadian Club of Ottawa event. It's going to be a barn burner as well, just like this one. And it's the post-pandemic future of municipalities and how COVID-19 is affecting Canadian cities. They all have grids, and we all know what needs to be done at a personal level, but we're going to bring in three of the country's big mayors, Toronto's John Tory, Calgary's Naheed Nenshi, and Ottawa's Jim Watson to discuss how we're going to tackle it from a municipal level, and it's going to be gangbusters. So that's November 5th, 12 noon. Please log on to CanadianClubOttawa.ca to register for that, and be sure to listen to Francis's podcast. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your time and your attention to this important matter. See you next time.
Thanks, everyone.